When someone you love dies, you probably know exactly what to do. A funeral, a grave, or an urn, some kind of ceremony where people gather and say something true about the person who's gone. It feels obvious, almost automatic, but none of that is automatic. Somewhere, a very long time ago, humans had to invent it, and figuring out exactly when is one of the strangest arguments in all of archaeology. Here's the problem. A dead body left in a cave can end up looking almost exactly like a body that was deliberately buried. Sediment falls slowly over centuries and settles around bones the same way a shovel would. Roofs collapse, trapping whatever's underneath in a curled, protected position. Animals drag things around and leave them somewhere new. So when archaeologists find old bones arranged in a shape that looks careful, deliberate, tucked in, how do you prove a person actually did that on purpose? Tens of thousands of years after the fact, with absolutely no one left to ask. In 1989, an archaeologist named Robert Gargett published a paper that blew this argument wide open. He looked hard at the most famous supposed Neanderthal burials, sites that had been taught for decades as clear proof of ritual and grief, and argued that almost none of them actually held up under scrutiny. Caves collapse on their own constantly, with no help from anyone. A body trapped under falling rock ends up protected, articulated, looking buried, without a single person lifting a finger. Gargett wasn't saying Neanderthals definitely didn't bury their dead. He was saying the evidence people kept pointing to could just as easily be explained by geology doing exactly what geology does, on its own, indifferent to who was underneath. It's an uncomfortable idea that grief this old might partly be a story we told ourselves because we badly wanted it to be true. And one of the most famous stories turned out to be exactly that kind of story. In a cave called Shanidar in what's now Iraqi Kurdistan, archaeologists found a Neanderthal skeleton surrounded by clusters of ancient pollen, and someone proposed something beautiful. What if he'd been laid to rest on a bed of flowers? Yarrow, grape hyacinth, thistle, arranged across a body by people who loved him. The idea spread everywhere, into textbooks, into documentaries, into the popular imagination of what Neanderthals were actually like deep down. Then later, researchers looked much closer at exactly where that pollen sat and how it clustered underground, and a far less romantic explanation emerged. A small burrowing rodent native to that exact region is well known for stockpiling flower heads in underground caches, the same way a squirrel hoards seeds. The pollen probably wasn't a funeral offering at all. It was likely rodent food storage, tens of thousands of years old, quietly mistaken for grief. So intentional burial is genuinely hard to prove, and plenty of the old famous evidence hasn't survived close scrutiny. But somewhere, the practice clearly did begin for real, and when the evidence finally is solid enough to trust, it holds up in a way that's hard to argue with. Around 100,000 years ago, in a cave called Kafze in what's now northern Israel, early Homo sapiens buried a child roughly 12 or 13 years old inside a rock recess carved specifically to hold the body. The skeleton lay flexed on its back, deliberately positioned, not collapsed or crumpled the way a body falls when it simply dies where it stands. 2 red deer antlers rested against the child's chest, touching the bones of the hand in a way that ruled out coincidence, and thick red ochre coated the surrounding sediment, pigment that had to be carried in from somewhere else and worked into the grave on purpose. The archaeologist Bernard van der Meersch, who documented the site, had no ambiguous rock fall to explain away here. Every part of it pointed the same direction. Someone had planned this. Once that door was open, it never really closed again, and it grew. Move forward roughly 66,000 years from the child at Kafze to a site called Sungir on the plains of what's now western Russia, and burial had turned into something closer to spectacle. 2 boys were laid into the ground head to head, one about 10 years old, the other around 12. Around their bodies, excavators found more than 10,000 carved ivory beads, dozens of ivory armbands, hundreds of pierced fox teeth, and long spears carved from straightened mammoth tusk, an object that alone would have taken enormous skill and time to make. Red ochre coated the graves exactly as it had at Kafse, tens of thousands of years and an entire continent apart. Someone had spent what was likely thousands of hours preparing all of this for two children who could never say thank you. The paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkius, working with Alexandra Buzilova, went back and re-examined those two skeletons closely and found something that reframes the whole burial. Both boys showed signs of physical disability, bones that suggest they struggled to move the way other children in their group could. In a world defined by hunting, walking, and constant physical labor, these two children may not have been able to contribute much at all in the way their society usually measured worth. And yet someone gave them one of the richest burials found anywhere from that entire era of human history, not because of what they could do, because of who they were to somebody. That's not a small thing to build for two children who couldn't hunt or gather or carry their share of the load. Making thousands of ivory beads by hand, one at a time, takes real time, time that could have gone toward food or shelter or simply rest after another exhausting day of staying alive. Whoever did this decided that mattering wasn't about usefulness, that a body which had never once been able to pull its own weight was still worth an almost unreasonable amount of effort once it stopped moving entirely. Grief itself, it turns out, might be one of the oldest human technologies there is. Older than the wheel, older than farming, older than most of what we usually count as civilization. Which brings up an obvious question. If elaborate, deliberate burial takes real cognitive weight, planning ahead, holding a symbolic idea of a person even after their body stops working, does that mean it only belongs to us? To modern humans with our big brains and our language and our art? In 2023, a team led by the paleoanthropologist Lee Berger made a claim that upended that assumption completely. Deep inside the Rising Star cave system in South Africa, they found the remains of Homo naledi, a small-brained hominin species, brain roughly a third the size of yours, that lived around 250,000 years ago. Berger's team argued the bodies had been deliberately placed in chambers deep underground, alongside markings carved into the cave walls. Evidence, they said, of intentional burial and possibly even symbolic meaning made by a species nobody expected to be capable of either. Other paleoanthropologists pushed back hard. Some argued the bones could have washed into those chambers naturally, or been dragged there by predators, or simply accumulated the way bodies sometimes do in a cave system with only one narrow way in. The debate is still completely open. Nobody has settled it. Which means one of the oldest questions in this whole story, whether burial requires a brain like ours, might not have a clean answer yet, and might never. Step back and look at everything together. A skeptic who tore apart decades of romantic Neanderthal stories with cold, careful reasoning. A flower burial that turned out to be a rodent's pantry. Two disabled boys buried with more wealth than most adults ever touched, for no practical reason at all. A small-skulled species that might, or might not, have carried its dead into the dark on purpose. What connects all of it isn't certainty. It's the fact that somewhere, a very long time before you were born, a person looked at a body that could no longer do anything for anyone and decided it still deserved hours of careful, difficult effort anyway. Not because that decision was useful, because it wasn't, and they made it regardless. That instinct, spending real cost on someone who can give nothing back, is easy to take for granted now because it survived every single generation between then and you, unbroken, passed down until it became so automatic you'd call it obvious. It never was. Somebody had to decide for the very first time that a person was still worth something after they stopped breathing. And as far as anyone can tell, humans, in one form or another, never stopped deciding that since.